I am the Society's current president, and also the other hat that I wear is I'm a professor at the University of Kansas. We are very fortunate to have my two immediate predecessors, two other esteemed presidents emeriti in the room. And it really sort of, makes me feel that I have to be on my best behavior with the grown-ups. But in any case, it is an honor and delight to have you here. And for those who do not know, the presidents emeriti that I mean are Professor Grigory Grabovich, or George Grabovich in English, and Dr. Halina Hrein. And we are very fortunate to have them here with us. It is a privilege and an honor. And I also want to say that what a delight it is for us to host today's and tomorrow's conference, the inaugural Shevchenko workshop in Ukrainian Studies, which is a collaborative project that we are thrilled to have with two wonderful partners, the American Association for Ukrainian Studies, and its current president, Sophia Wilson, is here as well and will be one of the discussants. Thank you, Sophia, for being here and for all the help from AUS. And of course, Razom for Ukraine, which has been a wonderful partner to work, who has also made a very meaningful support in enabling our participants to be here, and also has been a wonderful sponsor and inspirer for more intellectual presence of Ukrainian studies in across US academia through its wonderful program, Ukraine on Campus. And we have the head of that program, Oleksy Martinyuk, with us here in the room as well. So it is wonderful to have this partnership that has resulted in the conference that we're hosting tonight. The Shevchenko Scientific Society in the US, for those who do not know, is the continuation organization of the original Shevchenko Scientific Society, founded in 1873 in Lviv. We have information brochures downstairs, so you can learn all about the history of NTSH from its founding in 1873. And we, of course, had a big scholarly conference on Ukrainian intellectual history when we marked its 150th anniversary. But we are very happy to continue not just looking at the past, but looking and embracing the future of Ukrainian studies. And this is what this initiative is about. I am deeply grateful to colleagues who put in a lot of work and whose initiative is behind this, which includes both our partners at AUS and Razom, but especially the Society's first vice president, Professor Olena Nikolayenko from Fordham University. She was the main inspirer and driver of this event, and it was a closely collaborative project involving all of us from all the three partnering organizations. And the idea is that we need to create a new Ukraine-focused forum that is especially showcasing and supporting the work of younger colleagues, recent PhDs, as well as people who are in the PhD programs working on their PhD dissertations, so that they can benefit from the kind of intellectual community that these kind of small, intensive workshops bring together. In other words, we are here as a group of like-minded people who are dedicated and excited about the research on Ukraine. We believe that scholarly study of Ukraine-related topics, past and present, is essential as a form of help for Ukraine in the trying times that Ukraine has been going through now as it continues fighting off criminal, brutal, and unjust Russian aggression. So while we are with our hearts and minds with the defenders of Ukraine on the front lines, and all of here, I'm sure, have done their fair share advocating for Ukraine, donating for Ukraine, explaining about Ukraine and why it matters in many different contexts, generating new knowledge, generating new scholarly knowledge on Ukrainian topics is a hugely important task for us as well. And this is what this workshop aims to do. It is an interdisciplinary workshop. Tomorrow we will have 3 panels as well as a closing roundtable. And the roundtable will bring together people from many different backgrounds, including another colleague I'm honored to recognize here, Dr. Katarina Smagli, who is both an academic and a diplomat visiting us from the Ukrainian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and she will be one of the speakers at the closing roundtable tomorrow. Tomorrow we will have 3 panels, as you can find out in our program. The first panel will be literature focused. The second and the third will be more interdisciplinary. The second panel's title is Contesting Gender Norms. And the third one is Social Identities and Resistance. So we have colleagues representing a wide variety of disciplines, including anthropology and history and obviously literature and culture. So this is something that we're also very happy to see. And we're also happy to see the diversity of universities represented all across this country, East Coast, Midwest, West Coast. So we are all here and we are all united in trying to advance knowledge of Ukraine. And speaking of the West Coast, it is my pleasure and honor to say a few words about our keynote speaker, Professor Paul Danieri. And as those of you who were here a few minutes earlier already know, and for others who have trickled into the room, it is my sad duty to say the second time that unfortunately, because of problems of the air traffic control situations, both weather-related and related to non-weather things we are all aware of, our keynote speaker, unfortunately, was stranded on his way here, and therefore he's not here in person, but he is with our thanks to the powers of the internet. And so very shortly, the screen is going to magically change, and instead of looking at the slide, you will see Professor Danieri. For now, I just want to say a few things about him. Paul Danieri is a professor of political science at the University of California, Riverside. He is one of the leading scholars of contemporary Ukraine in the world with a very rich and diverse record. He received his PhD in 1991 from Cornell University's famed Department of Government. He started teaching at the same place where I teach now, at the University of Kansas, and was there for quite a long time. And he and I both had a pleasure to serve in the roles of the directors of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies there. After KU, he was at the University of Florida before coming to UC Riverside in 2014. He has held a number of prominent administrative positions before returning to full-time teaching and research. People here in the room are familiar with his most recent monograph, Ukraine and Russia from Civilized Divorce to Uncivil War, published by Cambridge University Press. But Professor Danieri is an extraordinarily prolific author of collective monographs, as well as edited volumes and many different articles. To give you a little bit of an arc of his career, His first monograph, Economic Interdependence in Ukrainian-Russian Relations, was published by State University of New York Press in 1999. It was followed by the monograph, Understanding Ukrainian Politics, Power, Politics, and Institutional Design in 2007, published by M.E. Sharp. He also is the author of a very popular, influential textbook, International Politics, Power and Purpose in Global Affairs. And his co-edited books include State and Institution Building in Ukraine in 1999, St. Martin's Press, Politics and Society in Ukraine, also 1999 from Westview, Dilemmas of State-Led Nation Building in Ukraine, Prager, 2002, Choice Outstanding Academic Book, Aspects of the Orange Revolution, Democratization and Elections in Post-Communist Ukraine, Ibid and Verlag, Orange Revolution and Aftermath, Mobilization, Apathy, and the State in Ukraine, Johns Hopkins University Press, and the Sources of Russia's Great Power Politics, Ukraine, and the Challenge to the European Order. His most recent article, according to Google Scholar, is Ukrainian Public Opinion and the Path to Peace with Russia, co-authored with Alina Nishik and published in East European Politics. But if you go to his Google Scholar profile, you find that he is one, or indeed, of the leading political science specialists working on Ukraine and the broader region. And we are very fortunate that he will be joining us virtually through Zoom for his keynote presentation, a reflection on Ukrainian studies during wartime. Paul, I need your help in setting things up so we can welcome Professor Danier.
Oh, interesting. Okay. One second. That's right. Hello, Paul. Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Shocking.
I'll see if I can.
Are you ready for me to let rip?
Yeah. Is there any way you can turn your volume up at all, your microphone gain?
I can certainly just get it closer to my face.
That works.
How's that? Is that any better?
Yeah. Sounds good to me. Thank you.
All right. Oh, I see familiar faces. Okay. Well, thanks. Thanks to Vitaly and to the Shevchenko Scientific Society for inviting me. Thanks to Paul for working on the logistics, which came to naught. I made it as far as Dallas yesterday, where after my connection to New York was canceled, the folks at Southwest Airlines cheerfully told me that they booked me on a flight to arrive on Saturday. Oh, shit. We've got the filter on that only catches the obscenities. All right. You can hear me now. I can hear you fine. All right. The fact that I couldn't get here yesterday and that this is now happening, I'm blaming entirely on the Russians. Okay, so thanks for your attention. I'm so sorry I'm not there in person. It would be so much more fun to be there. But nonetheless, I prepared remarks. I'm going to deliver them, and then I'm happy to take questions, criticisms, whatever you have. When Vitaly originally asked me to give this talk, I thought, well, what am I going to say? And then I looked at the agenda and saw that almost everybody are humanists of one sort or another. And I really thought, oh, what do I have to say to these folks? I'm a social scientist. But what I have done is sort of dredged up from my computer hard drive an essay that I started writing in 2022, which at the time I called The Imperialism of Stupidity. And I think stupidity is not a very nice word, so I've now changed it to the imperialism of ignorance. But it's in many part my reaction to how social science has addressed, and particularly my field, political science, international relations, has addressed the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and why we desperately need the humanists to save us. I have written a lot on the war in Ukraine. I've written on Russia-Ukraine relations going back 30 years or more. And from the way, things in social science, especially in political science these days, is you view events like this not as being unique, but as belonging in a larger category. So this is a war. In international relations, we study wars, and we write about them from that perspective. And so we tend not to ask what is unique about this war, but rather how we can see this war in light of all the other wars we've had in history, and how this fits into that broader pattern, and how that broader pattern tells us how we should understand this war. And that leads to two things. One is that people like me who've written a lot about Ukraine, as a political scientist, I naturally look around for other cases to compare this to, and I've done some of that. But the other is that people who are general specialists on international relations have been writing and commenting widely on this war. And I am going to contend, and have been contending for 3 years now, that this has led to, actually for 10 years, since 2014, that this has led to immense damage. The argument I'm going to make is not that Ukraine should be left to the Ukrainians. I think that would be wholeheartedly wrong. I strongly disagree with that. But rather that this war and our understanding of this war has made clear the importance of the humanities in general, of literature in particular, and mostly what I'm going to focus on today is narrative. And I mean that in a whole bunch of different ways that those of you who are humanities scholars will probably see as either being elementary or contradictory or something, because I'm not a scholar of narrative. So the cases that I'm going to make is about the importance of literature, film, the arts in general, particularly for people like me, and for people like John Mearsheimer who want to write about this war. And if you don't know who John Mearsheimer is, good. That's a positive thing. He's a political scientist who gets millions of hits on his videos, saying things, basically putting forth this line that the war is all about NATO expansion and it's America's fault that Russia invaded Ukraine. And to put it as delicately as I can, I disagree. So there's a lot of ways of talking about this, but one of them, I'll talk about in a couple of different ways, but the first one is the one I think everyone's most familiar with at this point, which is this idea of great cultures and lesser ones that's brought us to discussions of decolonizing Russian and East European studies. I expect that many of you have been involved in those conversations, and I doubt that I have much to contribute, except to say that I think the problem is much more deeper and much more resistant to change than we want to believe. Whole generations of college-educated Americans, right, have been raised on the idea that Russian literature is this great literature. Russian history is the history of a great nation, and so on and so forth. And I'm not exactly going to argue with that. I love War and Peace just as much as the next person does. I've been known to listen to Tchaikovsky from time to time, and so on. But obviously, or I think obviously, we've been way too unself-reflective about what goes with that, what goes on, what goes along with our ideas of how great the Russian novel is, for example, which I kind of tend to still believe that there are some very good Russian novels. By building a canon of Russian literature and a whole curriculum of Russian literature and this, that, and the other, obviously, right, we marginalize others, but it also shapes how we think about Russia. And I'm going to suggest it shapes how we think about Russia, especially for people who don't think about Russia very much. And so I think that's one of the ways in which our conversation about decolonizing Russian studies or Russian and East European studies sometimes misses the mark, because we've been very focused on ourselves as academics, whereas actually I think most of the damage is being done outside of the academy. So just to give one example as it relates to social science, and it's just a personal reflection from a kind of an amazing experience I had a couple of years ago, and Kathy Warner, I think, was present there. If my memory serves me, I got asked shockingly, from my perspective, got asked to be on a panel discussing the English translation of Volodymyr Raffayenko's Monogreen at an ACES conference a couple of years ago. And I don't know nothing about literature. I don't really know anything about anything. But because they wanted me to just give some background on the war. It's like, okay, I can do that. But it prompted me to read the book. And it tells a story, a narrative, I'm going to say, about a person who's displaced from the war in Donetsk, moves to Kiev and decides to learn and speak Ukrainian. And it provided what for me was this very new personal perspective on the problem that, like, real people in Ukraine at the very individual level are grappling with to come to grips with their identity when the thing that they thought was their language and so on turns out they realize is this tool for oppression. Meeting Raffayenko in person and talking to him about his personal experience really made an impression on me. And what it highlighted to me is what we are missing in social science, even when we do very good social science, what we're missing. And so the flip side of Raffayenko's book, and of course there's many others, but that's the one I'm just focusing on or using as an example. There is so much great social science research on identity politics in Ukraine, especially as it relates to language use. Volodymyr Kulik has published really great work on this. Henry Hale and Olya Onachev published. It's probably been, Dominique Aurel going back to the 1990s, it's probably been, in my estimation, I haven't counted it up, the single most widely studied question in Ukrainian politics is about identity, language, and ethnicity. And it's almost all done with survey research, which is how we do these things in political science. And so those surveys are essential to get a very broad picture of what's going on and to establish what we like to call in our methods classes external validity. The idea that what we are saying is true across a broad population of people. But those surveys, as good as they are, and I'm absolutely not criticizing the work of the people I'm talking about, they're fantastic. But it can only do what it does. It doesn't tell us anything about the so-called internal validity, which is the actual ways in which individuals, one by one, in different ways from one another, are experiencing language and ethnicity and national identity, and either consciously or subconsciously maybe changing how they see those things. Now, more qualitatively oriented social scientists, qualitatively oriented social scientists will publish ethnographies, and there are some great ones. But I'm still going to suggest that fiction, whether it's in the form of a novel or a film or a poem or something else, can still do something that none of us can do in social science. And sort of that was what I took away from that conversation with Raffayenko. What this means, to put it in slightly different words, is that we as social scientists, and I'm picking on myself now, I hope, are sometimes pretty good at explaining things, but very poor at understanding them. We're very good at seeing the big patterns and seeing things from the outside in and making them appear logical and consistent with what we know about the rest of the world. But we're not so good at understanding them from the inside out on their own terms, and especially in terms that are that the people who are actually doing the stuff that we're talking about understand them to be, right? The anthropologists are better at this than the political scientists, but I'm still going to say there's something from literature and literature studies that none of us is getting at as effectively. And to be honest, I'm ashamed to admit this, but I've had a couple of friends, Sherman Garnett at Michigan State in particular, who was a Russian literature major who went on to do a lot of work in the State Department and the Defense Department in the early 1990s related to Ukraine. He was absolutely convinced that if you didn't understand the literature and the culture and the history, you weren't going to get any of this stuff right. And it's only taken 30 years for me to come around to agreeing with him. So the good news, and I don't think there's much good news, to be honest with you, but anybody who knows me will know that's par for the course. The good news is, of course, you all, right? the growing number of people getting PhDs in universities and doing work that is focusing on Ukraine, on Ukraine's own terms, or in the terms that Ukrainians would understand. I'm not sure this is sufficient to bring about the kinds of change I'm hoping for or advocating for, but it's certainly necessary. There's probably some other things that are necessary as well. Another thing that I think is really important, and I'll give a pitch for my friend Oleg Kotsuba, the efforts of HURI, the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, to publish more Ukrainian literature, and especially to make it available in English translation, so that people can read it who don't necessarily read Ukrainian. So I want to return to this idea about the importance of narrative. And I'm thinking now especially of historical narrative. I was just yesterday, day before yesterday, I had to teach a class on Russian foreign policy, and it is called Russian Foreign Policy, the class, teaching about Putin's great work of scholarship on the history of Russians and Ukrainians, or whatever it's exactly called. But also about the tales that are, I also want to talk about the tales that are told of the promises made and broken regarding NATO expansion. And again, some very, very good scholars have dug deeply into these issues. And in many cases, I think still managed to not quite get it right. Why is that? Well, while I'm going to talk about narrative, I'm going to digress briefly into psychology, just to explain what I'm talking about. There is a powerful tendency, and the psychologists have been measuring it on our undergraduates for years, decades even, to give more credence to new information that fits what we see, and to discount the information that discredits what we already think. So to the extent this is true, the point is trying to change the views of scholars, of policymakers, commentators, or laypersons is like it's like pushing on a rope. It is extremely difficult to convince people that something's not true once they think it's true, or to convince them of a narrative once they've got a different narrative in their heads. And of course, the narratives about Russia and Ukraine were established decades, if not centuries ago. And while the narratives about the U.S. role in this conflict are more recent, they are extremely powerful, and they touch on extremely powerful, broader narratives that are popular among a lot of people right now. In particular, right, the narrative about the United States screwing things up in Russia and Ukraine fits so well with the narrative of the United States having screwed things up in Iraq and Afghanistan, which I suspect many of us agree with, that it's hard, or it's very easy to say, oh yeah, this is I know what that looks like. It looks like that thing there. So there's this famous line that's falsely apparently attributed to Mark Twain, right? That a lie will get halfway around the world before the truth can get its shoes on. And the Russian narrative, I'm going to say a narrative can get halfway around the world before the truth can get its shoes on. And the Russian narrative on this war, on Ukrainian-Russian relations in general, on Russian-American relations after the Cold War, has gotten a long, long head start on the narratives that I think are probably closer to the truth. So this then brings me to the importance of history. Having talked about literature and culture just a teensy bit, I'll now talk about history equally superficially. The point I'm making, of course, is that these narratives are really important, and it's really important that we be able to critically evaluate them, which I'm sure all the historians in the room are doing in their work that they're doing. But what strikes me, especially as a political scientist talking to other political scientists about this, is how few of the people who do political science of this region, especially the people who come at it from being general students of war and conflict, how many of them are able to critically evaluate these narratives, and they're unable to evaluate them simply because they don't know the history. They've never read it. They don't have a broad enough or a deep enough understanding of the various events being talked about, going back to 1991, let alone going back to 988 or whenever we want to start the scholarship, to actually be able to be intelligent consumers of what they've been fed, or even to really self-critically evaluate what they think. So I'm really then making a pitch for the importance of historical scholarship, because I think that these imperial or Russocentric narratives have predominated not only because Russia has been promoting them for centuries, which of course they have, but because Western scholars have been amplifying them for a long time. And sometimes, and most times I would say completely unwittingly amplifying them. And you can't just undo these things. Western scholars, as I've suggested, Western scholars have amplified them in part because they suit other agendas such as isolationism or anti-liberalism. But again, in many cases, it's simply either because people have failed to put in the time to really read deeply into the history, or that they're sort of, they just don't have the historical background to do it. So having quoted Twain, Twain didn't really say that, but Keynes did say this. Keynes famously said, practical men, he was writing in the 1930s, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist, right? And his point is people who don't think they're thinking theoretically are still thinking theoretically. I use this line with my undergraduates all the time. But as applied to this particular context, what it means is that there are a lot of folks out there who are very influential, who believe themselves not to have been influenced by anything, right? They don't see themselves as repeating a Russian narrative or as even taking a side in a debate. They simply know what they know, but in fact, they are the slaves of some defunct historian of Russia, or more likely, some Russian propagandist. So if we replace Keynes's practical men, or replace the defunct economist with a defunct historian or political scientist, I think that kind of represents the problem that we face today. To me, the roots of this go back to an intellectual battle that was fought and lost in American universities in the 1980s and 90s. And a few people in the room might remember, those are the famous area studies debate. And we don't need to go through this, typical academic politics. But the big pitch was made at the time that we don't need people in our political science departments who are experts on Russia or experts on Ukraine or experts on China, right? What we need is people who understand thematic problems across the globe. We need specialists on conflict, specialists on protest, and so on. And that things like places like Russia or China or Ukraine were merely data for these broad theories that these general scholars were going to write if they were smart enough. And so essentially those positions largely got eliminated, although some places have retained them, but even then it's mostly been pared back. And so we very much tried to erase that cross-disciplinary scholar who knows a great deal about one country, as well as some broader political scientists. There's not a lot of those folks around. And I suspect that's a big part of the problem. So let me bring this then to my specific work on Ukraine, right? Why not talk about me a little bit? And the two things I'll talk about. One is as a teacher. So I teach this course on Russian foreign policy, and I've done it. The first time I taught it, it was called Soviet foreign policy, but the Soviet Union disintegrated the week before the class started. So that was 1991. And I will say to those of you who feel like the thing you thought you were studying is changing so fast right before your eyes, all I can tell you is you'll survive it. And sometimes turned out that the post-Soviet Union was a lot more interesting than the Soviet Union. So there is possibility for good news. Okay, so teaching Russian foreign policy, well, where do you start, right? I've always started the story. I always do a chunk of history before we get into the current stuff, because the students don't know any of it. And I always start in 988, right? The famous Kievans getting dunked in the river and baptized. And I've done that because I think if you want to understand much of the successive history of Russian foreign policy, and in particular Putin's claims today, you need to understand this whole story he tells about what happened in Kiev in 988, and that it means that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. But I've come to fear or to worry that I'm actually doing more harm than good when I do that. I worry that by starting the story in 988, my students are getting the idea that the legacy of Kiev and Rus is objectively more important than it is. That it is an objective big thing in history that that its impact is obvious, rather than being part of some narrative that was constructed later, and almost always with the goal of justifying Russian territorial expansion. So I also try to raise the idea that Russian foreign policy actually begins later, right, in the 14th or 15th century, when Muscovy, right, throws off defeats the Tatars in battle, and really then begins expanding outwards. And I'm very tempted, therefore, to stop using the adjective Soviet to describe the policies of the regime that was in power from 1917 to 1991. Rather than talking about that as Soviet policy, I think in many important respects, I should probably just call that Russian foreign policy, because in the end, I think it's got a lot more continuity rather than differentiation from with what came before and after. I sometimes think I should call it Muscovite foreign policy, because it's really this political entity based in Moscow, although I guess it's also based in St. Petersburg for some time. So that's what I'm struggling with as a teacher. The thing that I'm struggling with as a scholar, and maybe not even struggling with, but just complaining about, is the question of, if you want to write a book about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where do you start? A lot of books have started in 2014. That's when the first invasion happens, or maybe you go back to 2013 and you talk about the Euromaidan and what led to the Euromaidan. You could start in 2004. The Orange Revolution is, I think, a good place to start from. I started in 1990, 1991, and why? And I argue that only by going back to 1990, 91 to start the narrative can you see that Russian leaders across the political spectrum are insisting on getting Ukraine back long before NATO expansion is a twinkle in anybody's eye, right? In other words, only by going back to 1990, 91 do you really see the evidence that contradicts this. It's all about NATO expansion. Only by going out and digging out Putin quotes from 2002 do you get Putin saying in 2002, I really don't care if Ukraine joins NATO. It's none of our business. Starting the narrative all the way back at the beginning of at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union completely disrupts a whole series of claims by Putin and by his apologists about what caused the invasion and what justifies it. But it makes for a very weird book, because it's a book explaining something that happened in 2022, and you really are only going to get to it if you start in 1991. You're really only going to get to 2022 in the last chapter or two. And that's the book that I've written, but it's not the book that most people have written, because if you want to write a book that focuses on what people are really interested in, you're going to do this foreshortening where most everything is in the last few years leading up to 2022, and then you're going to summarize what came before. That's what we do in order to explain things to people who may have relatively little knowledge and don't necessarily want to read all that stuff. But in doing so, I think we've created a lot of narratives that, despite their best intentions, are fundamentally flawed. And I think when we do so, ironically, we do Russia's work. And that's why I made up this term. Actually, I made it up just because I was cranky. The imperialism of ignorance. And the point is that the two things go together, right? These imperial narratives can really only be promulgated and can take root the way they have in the minds of so many scholars who are so incredibly influential, if those scholars are fairly ignorant to begin with about what actually happened, and if they remain ignorant rather than actually going and learning the history. And so it's why, for all of my grumpiness about this topic, I'm so glad to see so many people doing work on Ukraine. And if there's anything good that comes out of this war, and we'll see about that. But one of the things that's coming out of this war is a lot more funding, a lot for research on Ukraine, a lot more people interested in research on Ukraine, and a much more international dialogue on what's going on in Ukraine. In particular, people being trained in countries where there's still a lot more area studies being done, which I think is really necessary and valuable. I don't think changing these narratives is going to happen in time to shape the outcome of this war, but it may happen over the scope of the careers of the people who are just starting out. And I think that's got to be That's got to be the hope. So I will stop there. That was maybe a little bit more of a rant than I intended, but so it is. That's what I'm thinking about, and I'm happy to take questions.
Hi, I just wait here.
Hi, Vitaly.
I'll be on the other side here. No, it's okay. I want the audience to be for you to be able to see the audience. And colleagues, friends, do you have questions or comments for Professor Danieri? Okay, Kathy, please.
Hi, Paul. It's nice to see you
Hi there.
on a screen. So I wanted to sort of, when you mentioned, going back to 1990, 1991, I remember there was so much talk about borders and how does one mark space? And that's
Yep.
always been something that I've been thinking about, regardless of how this war exactly ends. Obviously, those borders are going to be marked in a totally different kind of a way.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you could, given what you were mentioning before about a broad political kind of perspective, thinking about different kinds of borders and borderlands. Back in 1990, 1991, a lot was made of the fact that, Ukraine was the very name of the country, was a borderland. And yet now we're going to have other kinds of borders dropped into this land. And I'm wondering if you could speculate a bit on that, given, the comparative angle that you have, whether it's to, other occupied areas like Abkhazia or other disputes that remain unresolved, like the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I haven't thought about it much. So what I'm saying is coming very much off the cuff. But I think about some different kinds of borders. You mentioned Abkhazia. You mentioned the situation in 1991. I'm going to throw in a third example, which is the European Union. Because in the European Union, they've dealt with the borders over the last 30 years, especially since the Schengen Agreement, in a way that's kind of unheard of historically, which is just say, oh, go ahead. No, we're not too worried about it, right? So that's one kind of border. When the Soviet Union came apart in 1991 and Ukraine declared independence, there was a huge question, right, of what is going to be the nature of the border between Russia and Ukraine, just to take that one example. Are we going to set up customs posts? There are so many people who've been used to moving back and forth in these areas. So I think we're going to have to see, but in this case, I think given the nature of this conflict, we are going to see a border that gets demarcated and that gets armed to the hilt. So I guess I should come up with another example, is the border between East and West Germany during the Cold War, or just the entire the border that we used to call the Iron Curtain, a border that is militarized, that it's very difficult to cross from one side to the other, and so on. I think that's what we're likely to see. But rather than trying to give you an answer, I just echo the importance of the question in terms of how these countries down the road, 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, begin to deal with each other. But also getting back to some of the stuff I talked about initially, what this means for people living their lives in these places. Again, some of the narratives you read about people who were living in the gray zone, as it was sometimes called, between 2014 and 2022. I suspect the new border is going to be more clearly defined than that. But it's going to have this immense impact on how people live their lives. And of course, it's already happening with people who, at very short notice, are finding themselves right on a different side of the lines of control that may have existed 2 weeks ago. Yeah, so it's a good question.
Paul?
Hi. I like the literature tie-in, and I was hoping you can give us some recommendations from Ukrainian literature that are not just great literature, but especially relevant to these power dynamics and historical themes you talk about, and or just a good deep program from the. I got a good deep program, as it were, from the cult of, shall we say, the received canon, Pushkin, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky.
Yeah. I think I am not the best qualified person to do that. I know that the American Association of Ukrainian Studies a couple of years ago tried to put together some lists that I'm going to point you to. And I suspect there are some, I see, is that Halina Hrin I see there? There are some people in the room who are going to be able to give you better suggestions than me.
Yes, so we are fortunate in that we have actually on the literature translation and the literature available side, quite a powerhouse here.
Just one of the interesting questions while we pass the microphone is, Nikolai Gogol / Hohol. I don't know who he gets labeled with these days. But it's hard to read a book like Dead Souls and not see something that very much echoes certain aspects of Ukrainian and Russian or Ukrainian politics in the 21st century in terms of kind of the absurdity of some of the corruption. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it is perfect because I was just going to mention, and I have one of my graduate students in the room, that this semester we're doing a graduate seminar called Nation and Empire, and first half of the class was on Hohol, and now the second half of the class is on Shevchenko. So we have had a deep dive into Hohol, making people rethink it, and we have a very international class. There are people from many different backgrounds, from Italy, from Sweden, or from other parts of the former Russian Empire, like from Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan. So minds are being opened and things are changing, and people do not look at the whole at the same kind of way, but this required this kind of deep dive to switch gears. It is happening, but it's a work that needs to be done, and I'm not sure that every university campus where there is a Slavic literature program is doing a similar kind of project. This is not to toot my own horn, but it's just saying that this is a kind of a work that is very important for us to do. And thank you for bringing this up. But now I'm passing the mic back to Katerina.
All right, but I'm going to say something first. Sorry, Katerina. I mean, the other person I absolutely love, but we don't typically think of as Ukrainian, is Isaac Babel, right? A Jew from Odessa who wrote in Russian. But if we think of people living in Odessa as Ukrainians, his depiction of the Civil War and of how things were done in Odessa, it's great reading. And again, I actually think it tells us a lot about politics in a lot of places. All right, go ahead.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your talk. You must understand that I come to this conference just as Professor Chernetsky said, both as an academician and a diplomat. And I was very much caught by your reference to a friend of yours or a former student of yours who studied literature and now worked, did you mention the Pentagon or the State Department? And then you implied that better understanding of literature makes him a better expert on the region. And I immediately thought of another example of George Kennan, who loved Chekhov and is famously known to begin his talks in the United States and elsewhere on Russia by talking about Chekhov. And it is an anecdotal example that he could spend 3/4 of the lecture talking about Chekhov than about Soviet Union and Russia in particular. But then the question is, did this knowledge of Chekhov make him a better expert? Because, as you know, especially by the end of his life, he argued that Ukraine should not be any time offered NATO membership, that it will lead to war, and that Ukraine somehow doesn't deserve its sovereignty and entity and its power in global affairs. So would you please a little bit develop on how literature necessarily makes someone a better expert on the region and in terms of policy analysis and policy recommendations?
Yep, it's a good point. You mentioned Kennan. It's an ideal case. I think of Strobe Talbot, who was a Russian literature student at Oxford, and then really made Russia policy in the Clinton administration. And I remember somebody saying to me, and it was either in Moscow or Kiev, back at that time, saying, Strobe Talbot knows nothing of politics. Understanding literature is not sufficient to make you wise, but I would suggest it is more necessary than most of my peers in political science believe. Alexander Solzhenitsyn presumably knew a lot about literature. I'm not sure it brought him much wisdom when it came to Russia's relations with Ukraine. So it's not that it's a magic elixir, but you at least have a chance of understanding things differently and more deeply than if you're only doing research based on general phenomena, right? I really think it's got to be both. But even then, no education has ever been a magic potion to cure stupidity or mistakes.
Yes.
Дякую. Hi, thank you so much for your remarks. As a young person who has kind of wavered between literature and international relations for the very few years objectively that I've been in these fields, it was very encouraging to hear. I guess I have a somewhat practical question. Being in both literature and IR spaces and kind of speaking to much older, wiser people in both fields, I've often tried to make a very similar argument to the one that you've relayed now, nowhere near as eloquently, I fear. And I've been met with a lot of very encouraging comments. People tended to agree. And yet afterwards, what I found is that those people would then go, for example, in ACs, one group of people always into the rooms where you have literature presentations, and then the other group of people into rooms where someone is talking about the relative merits of this or that counteroffensive, or relative efficacy of drone strikes in this or that location. And so my question is, what do you think are the best steps to take to go from point A to point B, to kind of go from words of encouragement, which are wonderful, to getting all of these people in the same room, and perhaps even more importantly, getting that to be like willing and kind of something that everyone is excited about? Thank you.
Yeah. So this is why I wish I was in New York, because I would go corner you later and ask a whole bunch of questions. So if you want, send me an email at some point, and you and I can talk, because I don't know. I'm really encouraged by what you say. I think if I just think about, I've been in 3 political science departments across my career, and I think about trying to fight that particular battle in any of those 3 departments, and I think, I did it once and lost. I'm not sure I want to do it again. So I don't know what the answers are, but what I would say is, even if you, what we probably need to do is start putting together some panels at ACs or at ASN that very explicitly are meant to bring social sciences and humanities together for specific purposes. That's probably the best thing to do, and go from there. I think it's got to start among like-minded people, rather than trying to win battles in department meetings when you're 1 against 20.
Thank you.
This is wonderful to hear, and I see that we have multiple hands in the room. So I would venture to suggest that our event is an example of this kind of event that brings people of many different disciplines together in one room, and it is indeed very, very important to do that. So Grigori had his hand first, then Kathy, then Olena.
I don't know if you can see me, Paul. Yes. Anyway.
Hi, George.
Yes. It's a pleasure to listen to you. I'm very much involved in this issue, and somehow awed by it, because all the problems you spoke of are extremely real, and I know it from an experience of about 45 years of teaching. We are products of a system that was in place before we came onto it. It's like becoming part of the discussion that ends up becoming the canon. Canon is just a big discussion that is ongoing, and it will go on after you leave. But the main issue in this canon and in this discussion is that there were priorities and presences that ended up forcing you into a position of superiority or inferiority. And Ukraine ended up being a very late starter. And I'm not going to go into Ukrainian cultural or intellectual history at all, but all of these matters are entirely new to the American public. And they have been unfortunately also handicapped by or coerced by so-called Slavic studies, which is essentially Russian studies. In this country, Slavic departments are very few that actually have more than just Russian, as we all know. And the fundamental issue that I see in the problems that you raised is what is the relationship between Ukrainian studies and Russian studies? And how can that be corrected? How can it be improved in the absence of the desire for improvement on the part of many of the Russianists themselves? And this is a fundamental issue which and I'm looking at it from a perspective of having been not a compliant, but a captive audience, as it were, in the process. It seems paradoxical and maybe unfair to myself or to others to put it in those terms, but I can't think of it in any other way, because I woke up in a certain way to what Russian studies is after the invasion. And after seeing the response of various colleagues to that invasion. Anyway, I'm also turning this into a rant, as you were saying. So, you know, it's very difficult to speak of it because it's so autobiographical. And at the same time, we have to have distance to it and see it in terms of various structures that are impacting it.
Yeah, and one of the ways that we see this, you know, in the university is in the scarcity of tenure-track faculty lines, right? Even the most open-minded, sympathetic Russianist doesn't want to lose the checkoff line so that you can hire a Ukrainian literature specialist, right? And it's because they think that whatever that checkoff line is, you know, the line in 20th century Russian drama or whatever it is, it's like they can't imagine living without that. And as resources are scarcer than ever, especially in the humanities, it just becomes harder and harder. And so these things do have a way of presenting them to us as conditions that we can't change. And so it's why I appreciate so much what the previous questioner talked about, which was sort of some fairly concrete things to do that might start bringing about some change.
Just briefly, as a comment here to this, I'm wondering if if we conceived of area studies not so much to break out of the nation state and in a broader regional way. I know naming is a huge problem, of course. I went to school at Columbia, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, we had the Harriman Institute for the Advanced Study of the Soviet Union. And suddenly there was this giant land grab. You know, the Central and Eastern European Center was trying to take part of it, and the Middle Eastern Studies was trying to take other parts of the former Soviet Union, and the Harriman didn't know what to call itself. And at the end, it just became the Harriman Institute for Advanced Study. Totally unclear what this advanced study was of, but it was advanced. But nonetheless, I think sort of given what you just said about the precariousness of resources and the number of tenure track faculty is just not growing. That, you know, if we had centers that deliberately in a regional sense, brought scholars from different disciplines together, that I think would be helpful. But really, what I really wanted to was just respond to what you had said about how to really bring social scientists and humanities scholars together. And I'm sensitive to this issue because I'm a historical anthropologist. So I've got one foot in both domains, or so I think anyway. But I think part of it has to do with looking back critically at these pivotal moments when social scientists, by and large, got it wrong, such as, for example, the early 1990s with shock therapy. That was a whole lot of shock and not much therapy. and rethinking that, and why, were there enough people thinking, just to have another quick example, that in fact Russia would take Ukraine in the matter of days, when anyone who had spent any kind of time on the ground knew that, yes, there would be grandmothers throwing pickles off the balcony. It was not going to be fast. So I think there has to be some kind of critical reevaluation of how, thematically, I understand the rationale for that kind of privileging that kind of scholarly orientation, but I think we need to also see what the costs have been to that, by surveys where an entire country and histories get reduced to one of 30, 40 variables.
Yep.
And the only way to really get to that is to think about these, critically rethink these pivotal moments, and to see how the fate of, let's say, the Baltics and, Turkmenistan are vastly different. How Ukraine and, Kazakhstan are, and so on and so on. And how come there was very little understanding that was going to emerge? How could that be possible? But I think it's only possible if you sort of skirt to the side humanities, and actually skirt to the side people, history as the so-called detailed people, and so on and so on.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I'll just respond with a couple of things. One is there were people, of course. I think of Ken Jowett in particular, but there were others, right? The people who really knew, and actually a lot of Russians themselves, right? Leaving aside Ukraine, you mentioned shock therapy. There were a lot of people who knew a lot about Russia who said from the get-go, this is not going to work in these circumstances, and they were systematically ignored and sidetracked. I don't think Russia was going to turn out much better anyhow, but that's another story. The other, there are people who do this work. Catherine's books are very much kind of one foot in both camp. The other person I would just, especially if you're into drama or theater, Jessica Pisano's most recent book about, I forgot the title of it now, but basically uses dramaturgy to understand political campaigning in Ukraine and Russia. And it's really, really good. But of course, she is somebody who does the work. She learned to speak Hungarian, among other things. It's not easy to do. Yeah, next.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your talk. And I have just a question motivated by the comments made earlier by the student. It's Olena Nikolaenko.
That's what I thought.
And I think we have seen in recent years the growth of interdisciplinary programs. I think it's very popular at many universities. There is a creation of new interdisciplinary programs. So I would like to hear your perspective on how much you think it might benefit or not. Like Ukrainian studies, East European studies, whatever, or are all these interdisciplinary programs primarily created to bring together people who study AI or climate change or whatever? So if you can comment, especially given your experiences in the university administration.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of interdisciplinarity. I'm a big fan of interdisciplinary centers. Both as a graduate student, but especially as a faculty member at the University of Kansas, I benefited immensely. I don't think I could have had the career that I've had if I didn't start my career at Kansas, which had a pretty robust up and running program that at the time I joined it was called the Center for Soviet Area Studies, I think. And then it became the Center for Russian and East European Studies. And then we added something for Central Asia. We had a big fight about that. I don't know if Vitaly was there yet when that happened. But absolutely, I could not have. I studied Ukrainian at the University of Kansas, which you could not have done right on most campuses in 1992 or 1993, I think it was. But you could do that, and there were a steady stream of visitors to engage with, and we had relationships, linkage grants, and so on and so forth. The background for all of those great area study centers was the National Security Education Act of 1957. And it was a great piece of legislation that has served the United States extremely well, but mostly has had the funding slowly ripped out of it in recent years. We hoped a little bit, there was a little bit of hope after the debacle in Iraq that there was going to be a new sort of investment in area studies and in interdisciplinary area studies programs, but it really didn't happen. And so, yeah, so we are ignorant collectively.
And sadly, with the current administration canceling Title VI altogether, we are in very difficult times as far as those things are concerned.
Yep.
Alexa.
Thank you so much, Alexa Martiniuk from Razom for Ukraine. I actually wanted to build on the question because we see this, you spoke to the value of this interdisciplinary area studies. And there's this rising tide of folks trying to invest in the interdisciplinary study of Ukraine right now. But at the same time, we see, for example, right, Harvard is projected to not have any PhD seats in the German studies department for the next 2 years, right? Something we consider like a more established department, for example, than Ukrainian studies across different institutions. So are there stopgap strategies you see in this regard, or any kind of hope for the future in kind of investing in this study against the backdrop of what we're seeing right now?
Yep. I can't say that I'm terrifically optimistic in terms of the United States. Canada has always, or at least since the 1990s, right? Canada did not disinvest when the United States disinvested. The United Kingdom did not disinvest when the United States invested. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot more going on in France and Germany than there used to be. There's a lot going on in Switzerland now, at least as far as I know. And of course, the biggest difference is, and the biggest thing to be hopeful about, is the extent to which Ukraine has now developed its own capacity to train the kind of scholars and to provide them good places to work that we're talking about. Yeah, I mean, I could go on about that, but again, I suspect people in the room know more than I do. So the number of people in some sense that can do this stuff is probably as high as it's been since I've been in the field. But there's just not a lot of jobs for them in American universities. And frankly, I think there's fewer and fewer jobs for them in the State Department or in the Defense Department or in the CIA, which is too bad, because there are, we like to beat up on the CIA because, they go and throw coups and stuff. But it is if you ever spend any time there, it is the analysis side of it. There's people with there's an incredible reserve of experience and knowledge about the region that I think is slowly being just let to retire, if not forced to retire. And it'll be a disaster sooner or later. There was this famous statistic back in 2003 or 2004 that of the however many thousands of people that the United States had in the so-called green zone in Baghdad, there were only 2 of them who spoke Arabic. And it's like, okay, you wonder why we got ourselves what we got in Iraq and Afghanistan. In the long run, ignorance has real high costs. And yeah, sorry, I'm ranting again.
Good evening.
But the Ukrainians, I just want to say the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian universities are doing as much as anybody to solve this problem.
Absolutely. Hi there. My name is Taras Ferencevich. I'm the current executive director of the Ukrainian Studies Fund. New to the position. And
great.
I'm not an academic. I'm a fundraiser, but I have some background. And you spoke a little bit about sort of like the very intentional effort of Russia, Soviet Union, now Russia again, of kind of creating this narrative that has become the dominant narrative, and the amount of resources dedicated to that, is sort of this soft power. Part of their foreign policy. And so I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on kind of Ukraine's efforts now. I think, what the First Lady has been doing with sort of organizing the Coalition of Ukrainian Studies has been great. Unfortunately, resources now are going towards more important things. But I would just love to hear your thoughts about kind of that kind of soft power diplomacy efforts in maybe coalescing some sort of, Project 2025 of Ukrainian studies to be able to change the narrative.
Yeah, I think that you mentioned the Ukrainian First Lady. The Ukrainian president himself is also partly because of the particular skill set he has, has been a very good representative for Ukraine in the sense that people will listen to him, right, and at least hear what he has to say, or at least some people will. So there's the good news is, I'm trying to think of this. Right, there's a whole definition of the Ukrainian optimist as somebody who thinks things can't possibly get any worse. Yeah, so that's me on this topic, which is the Russians have so dominated this narrative that there's no place to go but up. And I think there has been some progress. And the biggest sense of it is the damage that the Russians have done to themselves just by, number one, invading Ukraine, right? Because there's a whole bunch of people who just saw the bully for what it is, regardless of what they knew. They say they see a bully and they see somebody small fighting against the bully, and they'll go for the small side every time. And then, ironically, there's the fact that they couldn't pull it off, or at least so far they haven't pulled it off. Which not only are they a bully, but they're an ineffective bully. So the war has already begun to do some things to change the narrative on Ukraine and Russia. It's going to take a lot more time to undo some of this historical stuff. But if I can be optimistic about the war, and I think, let's just say 5 years from now, this war is over and we've got something that looks like a Ukrainian state still intact, it won't matter what Putin said about NATO expansion anymore, because the importance of that particular bit of very successful propaganda is largely going to be gone once this war is over. Does that make sense? Once this war is over, it's not going to shape spending decisions or anything else. And so some of this propaganda is going to just become irrelevant. And I suspect the longer term stuff, it will take a long time to introduce new narratives and correct some of this stuff. But I don't think that we're ever going to see a time again, I was certainly in my lifetime, and hopefully not in your lifetimes either, in which the Russian narrative, the great Russian narrative, is uncontested and is simply the way we all know it, right? Sort of the way that I learned about George Washington in elementary school. Or Thomas Jefferson, better see it. It's like, oh, who knew, right? That narrative is not coming back, probably. Does that make sense? But maybe you were asking what to do, and I think the thing we still have to do is we just have to keep at it every day, correcting people. Hopefully, to the extent that we can raise money and support publications and support conferences and get the word out there. And the Ukrainian Studies Fund historically, if I'm thinking of the right group, was instrumental in endowing these 3 chairs at Harvard. You can't overestimate the importance that has had, right? If it weren't for that work that was done, 50 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, who knows where we would be now, right?
Okay, we have several people who had their hands up. With the eye to not getting either our guest or ourselves too exhausted. We will wrap up in about 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay.
So a couple of short concluding remarks and questions. Please try to be concise.
Dr. Randieri, if you may comment on this, we spoke a lot about Ukrainian studies, but what is the state of Russian studies these days in the West? Has the canon changed for Russian studies, or do those scholars are still in the paradigm of great Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and less about Russia's war crimes, why the grabbing of Crimea was an enormously illegal thing to do? Like, do Russian scholars reconsider the paradigm they're in, and what can it tell us about the future of this discipline?
Maybe we should get the rest of the questions, and then I'll try to respond real quickly to all of them.
So I'm an optimist, and I also just I wanted to pick up on what you said, the Ukrainian Studies Fund. I mean, I think one way to change the narrative is, I think, the fact that Ukraine is likely to be a giant laboratory going forward. What I mean by that is if you look at the kind of massive destruction of Mariupol, Donetsk, and a whole host of other places, already there are all kinds of people looking at urban design in a totally new way. If you look at efforts to prosecute ecocide, there's all kinds of research that's coming out of how to measure and look at environmental degradation and devastation and legal change. And I could go on and on and on. My point being that this is a horrific tragedy, and no one would. And it's like the guys who got the Oscar for the movie about Mariupol. No one wants to pay this price, but I think Ukraine is going to be at the forefront of a wide spectrum of all different kinds of research, precisely because sort of the barriers to change have also been destroyed, along with cities and human and other kinds of life in Ukraine. So much has to be rebuilt that arguably also is an opportunity of sorts. And so my sense is that's also a way to craft all kinds of new narratives. But I hope that will be inspiring to some of your potential donors.
Thank you. It's Helena Hrin here. Nice to see you. I wanted to add just two items, maybe anecdotal, but perhaps sort of for all the young scholars here. One shouldn't underestimate, on the one hand, what individuals can do. Ukrainian studies for the longest time existed without departments, without structures, but with very, very dedicated people who really went to bat. And it's, you mentioned Jessica Pisano. My first two students at Yale were Jessica and Nathan Hodge, who was in charge of CNN in Moscow when the war broke out. So going on to that, the other question, the other point I wanted to raise is the importance of language teachers. Those are massive indoctrination machines. Those Russian language courses. I know you mentioned Strobe Talbot. I was there at Yale. I saw the program he went to. I talked to all the teachers who still remember him. There's a very good reason why he had the kind of perspective on Russia that he had. So not only individual scholars, but also people who teach language should not be underestimated, because you can really do a lot with that. But of course, essentially, we need the structures, we need the tenure track positions, we need the and we need the money to fund them as well. Okay.
Okay, Paul, concluding words of wisdom from you. We're eager to hear.
All right. Oh, yeah. Well, I realize I'm between you all and cocktails, so I'll talk fast. So Russian studies, I don't have my finger on the pulse of this. I'm at a university that doesn't have a big Russian studies program. I think it's as varied as the people there. I think there are a lot of people. I know some friends of mine from years ago who have really, really profoundly rethought what they're doing and how they're doing it and why. And I think there are a lot of others who've just kept plowing forward. I think a lot of Russianists, especially the ones who might have come from Russia themselves, would probably say, if they in an unguarded moment, probably say, yeah, you know what, Crimea really is Russian, so what's the big deal? I think we have to acknowledge that there's still people out there, a lot of people who are going to believe that. But I think there's a lot of, what I'm saying is there's a lot of variation there. Ukraine is a lab, Kathy's point, absolutely right. And as we think about what I think it makes so hard to answer the question about what should the funders be funding right now is, Ukraine is in this incredibly precarious situation, and we don't know what things are going to look like next week, let alone 2 or 3 or 5 years from now. It's easier to say in terms of, what we should be doing in North America, and it is trying, whether it's tenure track jobs and things on campuses, but trying to institutionalize in some way or another, right, ongoing things that put Ukraine and Ukrainians and Ukrainian arts and literature out there so people can see it, so it's forefront of people's mind. Because right now, let's face it, and this gets back to the broader point, which is the amount of creativity coming out of Ukraine right now is just blowing people's minds, right? A lot of it is in the arts. It's also in how to design drones and things. That has also totally changed the narrative about Ukrainians, right? It's like, wow, these people are resourceful. They're clever. And we've just got to keep that moving forward and harness it. And Holland's point about individuals, yeah. You could do things even on a campus like this where there's not a lot of interest. It's like, yeah, I find something to do every day. And I teach a course in Russian foreign policy. I don't have to do that, but I do it because it's on the books. And so I don't have to get a new course through the process. And I can teach about this stuff. And then language and the language teachers. Yeah, I don't know this for sure. But I do, it makes me wonder sort of, when the National Security Education Act was passed and we went and hired all of those Russian experts, how many of them were, sort of white Russian emigres who, shared the kind of ideas that are now causing a lot of these problems. I mean, I know there was a great diversity of them. Let's put it that way. At Kansas, we had a great librarian named Michael Pauly who spent as much of the budget as they would let him get away with on materials from Ukraine. Adam Ulam taught at Harvard for many years, and he was a Polish Jew from Lvov, and so on. But yeah, the language teachers.
So that's something we're actually trying to think about decolonizing. Indeed, we have to decolonize Russian studies textbooks. I know that Olga Titarenko, who now teaches at Yale, she also already had a previous position at the University of Nebraska. I mean, the problem is that Ukrainians are doing this hard work. A lot of the change that is happening in Slavic studies is because of Ukrainians who earlier got jobs teaching Russian literature, and then they are trying to change the discipline from the inside. And it's the same thing. Nobody else was trying to decolonize the Russian language textbooks, which are indeed horribly chauvinistic. Everything is, pretty and cute and absolutely no problematic thing to Russian history until somebody from the like Ola started actually doing it. We have at Kansas right now an example of a Ukrainian Fulbright historian who was asked to step in for an emergency, teaching an advanced Russian language class on history, advanced Russian through history. And they got a Ukrainian historian to teach that class, and my God, the result is completely different. So yes, what happens is that individuals matter, individuals really matter, and individuals who get inspired to make change. This is what we are hoping that our event tonight and tomorrow will help bring, is by having many like-minded people in the room. We, not only by discussing papers and presentations, but as we know at conferences, a lot of the things happens outside, and I'm really sorry, Paul, that you will not be able to join us for the cocktail hour, but I think it's going to be a very important thing. For now, on behalf of everyone here in the room and the conference organizers, of course, let me thank you very much for, despite the hellish travel experience and you not being here, we've had an absolutely wonderful keynote presentation from you and a brilliant discussion. Let's give Paul a round of applause, please.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate it. Hope next time to see you not on the screen, but in person.